Okay, I've been told that Maxine already finished and that I can probably start, but I hope I'm not cutting anyone off right now because the truth is that I actually can't see all of you. You guys can see me, but I can't see all of you, which is a very strange experience, especially after Maxine said so much about me being a great filmmaker. It makes me very nervous because here I am at 3 o'clock in the morning in Tel Aviv, streaming across the world to you in a quiet, empty room with a few roommates trying to sleep, probably on either side of these walls somewhere. But I think before anything else, I should say thank you for your time. And I'll tell you a little bit about who I am just very quickly, or I'll try to jump in a little bit and then we'll kind of get started into all of this. So as she said, I'm Eli, I'm a filmmaker. I've been doing filmmaking for a very long time now. Spent my career doing it. Most of the time it was a lot of promotional videos and recruitment videos and, fundraising videos, nonprofit videos. That was my world. And then October 7th happened and everything changed. And suddenly there I was in Israel at a very unique and difficult time. And I had a camera and I started filming things and I started creating and taking all those years of experience doing narrative filmmaking and documentary filmmaking and a lot of nonprofit work and commercial filmmaking and turned that lens towards capturing human interest stories on the ground in this country as the whole country shifted upside down in multiple ways and new stories were all over the place that needed to be told. And that ranged from everything from short films that we've been making, and I should mention all these films started getting picked up by the Times of Israel and being distributed around and some other news outlets, and it's been an interesting time, to say the least. Before I jump into what we're going to do right now, though, I just want to mention I'm very aware that many of the people in the community are connected, literally connected to many of the communities that were attacked, horrifically attacked on October 7th. And while I will be showing footage in general of the aftermath of that attack, I want to assure everyone I'm not going to be showing footage of some of the more graphic elements of that. And we're talking about, blood, gore, guts, things like that we've seen on the internet, that we've seen in news stories. But I still would anticipate this might be a little difficult, some of the imagery for people who are very connected into these communities. And I hope this is going to be okay to see. I just want to kind of put that out there ahead of time. And also, bear with me, and I'm glad that this is a community that I know. I don't know if I didn't hear it in the bio because I had to turn it off in the middle to get this thing started up, but I am from the Boston area. I spent most of half my life, I feel like, in Western Mass, going to Camp Vermont, New England. And so it feels, to be blunt, it's a real honor to be speaking to you all, specifically, because you're the community that I know, and you're a community that I grew up around. So you're my people. So thanks for bearing with me on this. All right, let's jump in. So what are we doing here? In a nutshell, I wanted to talk to you about two separate but related things. One is about a future project that I have going on right now, a documentary that I'm working towards making that's a little larger than some of the short docs that we've been creating so far as I've been out here. But I also wanted to take this opportunity to, for lack of a better word, to explain, I think, some stuff that has gotten lost in the frantic news cycle that's happened for the last 2 months. Basically, as soon as October 7th happened, there was so much information, so many stories, so much heartache, horror stories all over the place, that it was very easy for just about anybody to lose track of what was happening where. Many of the details fall away. There was real confusion, and there continues to be confusion. I've heard people refer to Kfar Aza as the Gaza Strip over and over when they're very different areas. And I'm not surprised because, to be blunt, even I got confused a lot of the time when I'm looking at maps and trying to figure out where this happened, because so many communities dealt with atrocities that even if it happened to one person, we would be outraged and the whole world would be watching. And this happened, roughly speaking, 1,400 people and communities around the world. So I say that because I think that I have and I should mention that for the last 2 months, I've spent significant time in these communities. I've heard hundreds of hours of testimony. One of the first things I did when this all started was I hooked up with an organization that was doing research. Essentially, we're a research organization on the ground, interviewing people very soon after the attacks to be able to pinpoint exactly where everything happened. Real detailed data analysis of what happened, where it happened, how it happened. And they needed someone to film some of the interviews from time to time, and sometimes just to sit in on interviews or to help translate, which I had a good friend that was doing with me. So in the end, I ended up having to watch and listen to hundreds of testimonies of survivors and families of hostages, and now, since then, also some hostages as well that have come back. And it's made me, I guess you could almost say in a weird way, and I would almost say unfortunately, a little bit of an expert, as much as one maybe can be right now while information is still all over, of what sort of happened on the 7th. And spending so much time down there, I think, has really shown me a lot of things that I see being missed over and over, or things that I take for granted. And I'll give you just one little example of this. The fact that just recently, in the last week or so, 2 weeks, we've started suddenly hearing all this news about sexual assault on October 7th. And for me, that was very strange because I've been hearing about that from day 2 through testimonies that was coming out all the time. This was not some new thing. So when I hear people say things like, oh, the Israeli army's made this up, I'm thinking, what are you talking about? I thought this was common knowledge. So it's these kind of details that get lost in this. And I'm going to try to take this opportunity to at least show, well, I won't go far into those areas specifically, but to show and maybe clear some of the haze around some of what happened. So let's jump right in. Let me start by pulling up a map, because I want to explain maybe a little bit on a map that I think might make some of this a little more sense. All right, so right here we have Israel, right? And we're going to just go down towards the Gaza Strip. On October 7th, as we know, Hamas terrorists rampaged through multiple holes all over this strip right here of land and into Israel as a whole, but they didn't really go far in. They really mostly stayed around this area called Kfar Aza, or the Gaza envelope. And to those that know everything I'm saying right now, I apologize that I'm reiterating things you know, but I know there's got to be a few people out there that are genuinely going, oh, I didn't quite put all of this together. So hopefully this will clear this up for some of them as we move in to going over some of the other communities and what happened in each community. So this area over here, though, this whole strip of land is what they would call the Kfar Aza, the Gaza envelope. And it's made up of lots of little communities. It's very heavily focused towards farming communities. And that's because the estimates out here that I've always heard have been about 60 to 70% of all of the produce grown in Israel are grown in this little region over here. Now, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, but my opinion is I think it's probably close to like 30 or 40%. But I think it goes without saying that it's a huge amount of food that is grown here. And so when these terrorists came in and rampaged and massacred through these communities, there was ripple effects that went out to all of Israel in multiple ways. And one of those ways was that part of the food chain was actually cut off completely. Now, roughly speaking, on this day, there was about, they think, roughly 1,500 terrorists that ran around within these communities, rampaging, killing, and doing all sorts of horrible atrocities. And they roughly killed about 1,400 people, but the numbers get a little bit confusing. They also kidnapped a lot of people, 240 hostages, as we know. But I want to point out that it was about 10 communities, give or take, kibbutzim, moshavs, and even small cities and small towns, where they raided, and sometimes they took over the towns, and sometimes the communities fought back and actually held them off. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but there's a few to really focus on that grab a lot of the headlines and that I want to kind of point out because they're all a little bit different, but there's also a lot of similarities. So let's take a look at some of these over here. So first of all, we have over here Sderot, and Sderot is a small city or town. People have different names for it these days, but it's really close to Gaza. You can see the border of Gaza is right here. It's about a mile away. We go just a little bit down the road and you have Kfar Aza. I know some people in the community are connected to Kfar Aza. And Kfar Aza was very badly hit, and we'll talk a little more about that in a little more detail in a little bit. But they're also very close to Gaza. It's a stone's throw away. So for terrorists to run in from here and, commit the atrocities that they did in Kfar Aza and then take people back into Gaza was not very difficult because of its proximity. It was just so close. If we go out a little bit and move right here, right down the road, you have Alumim. Alumim is where the migrant workers, that they've been called, the Thai and Burmese workers, were massacred and kidnapped. They usually are working with cows in large cow sheds. They call them the refet. And I'll tell you more about that shortly. And then over here you have Be'eri. And Be'eri is one of the largest kibbutzim in the area, which we'll talk more about shortly. I know, again, we have community members that are related to those in Be'eri. And then you go a little further down, you have Re'im. Now I want to point out again how close these are. I mean, this is right here. Driving to these places, we used to talk about being able to do a live streaming event like this where I could just go from area to area because they're so close to each other, it's so easy to travel between them. Re'im, by the way, is where the Nova Music Festival happened, but it didn't happen in Re'im. People get confused about this. It actually happened a little closer right across the fields over here in this area. And you can see by the way that these roads work, the way they were able to kidnap so many people from Re'im, from the Nova Music Festival, was through these back roads. We actually did a whole video on that you can see that's now up on the Times of Israel. We released it last week. That really shows that landscape. I think many people didn't realize what the landscape really looks like over there. It's vast, empty, large fields, which made it very, very difficult to hide from terrorists. And then right down the road over here, we have Nir Oz. And Kibbutz Nir Oz is a particularly difficult place to speak about for other reasons that, again, we'll speak about in just a little bit. So let me pull back up the main screen. What I'm going to show you is there's a lot of footage that I've put into the videos that I've made already that are out there. But there's a lot of footage that didn't get into at all. And there's also a lot of footage we've shot that we haven't actually made something with yet. What I'm going to show you as I explain what happened in some of these kibbutzim, I'm going to show you some of this footage in sort of its raw form. So bear with me, you'll probably hear all sorts of sounds or us talking in the background, things that don't usually make it into the cut. But I think these clips give you a real honest view of sort of what these kibbutzim are like, what they look like, what it feels like. So let's start with that first one. I'm going to start with, let's go with Alumim, which again is right over here. So Alumim is a small kibbutz. My goal here is to kind of walk through a few of these different kibbutzim, and then I'm going to tell you about a specific story in Be'eri, one that we're working on making a documentary for that I think is an extremely powerful story, really works well for Hanukkah, and you'll hear why in just a little bit. But let's talk about Alumim for a minute. Alumim is a small kibbutz, and I'm going to actually pull up a little footage from them for just a moment. When Alumim was attacked, they went after the migrant workers because that's all they could find. And to be very clear, Hamas did not discriminate according to who was who. They just went after anybody. And if you ask anyone who was down there, they attacked anybody they could find, anybody they would pass, cars, people, didn't matter where you were from. It was indiscriminate. It was the epitome of the word terrorism because it didn't matter who you were. They just wanted to kill you. So in Alumim, this happened early morning. I can play a little raw footage here. That's behind the burned out. This is a man who's showing us around. Let him speak.
It's a matter of focus of the terrorists that they planned to attack mainly two kibbutzes. One is...
I'm actually going to cut him off just a little bit and mention that's actually not true. They planned to attack many kibbutzes, but they only thought they were going to get away with two of them and were either extremely lucky or something went wrong and they were able to attack so many.
All the cows.
Yeah, and the burned barns together.
Yes, and the roof.
Behind him in the distance over there are the burned out barns that they threw RPGs and grenades at when they rampaged through. They also destroyed heavy machinery like this. Jesus. What did he say? And
Here you
that
can
sound you're
have a
hearing
nice picture of
is
the,
heavy artillery that's stationed right next to Kibbutz Alumim, shelling into Gaza right now. But I should also mention that every few minutes there were rockets that were flying overhead, and these are actually volunteers who've gone back to Alumim to try to take care of the cows who are there, because they need to be milked regularly or they get infections and they die. And many of them actually died of trauma after the attacks. This is something that wasn't really reported on. But it's important to note that when rockets come to this area, they only have about 6 to 7 seconds to find cover before they land. This is from the moment that the Tseva Adom, the red alert, kicks in. And go ahead.
It's surrealistic that we are working here in the cowshed, milking the cows, and we are in the middle of a war zone. That it's a disaster. A few meters from us, there was a massacre a few weeks ago. And you can hear the artillery on one hand and the bombs on Gaza on the other hand. And we are still keep milking the cows.
This is the inside of the burned out cow sheds that they destroyed. I'm going to move us along a little bit. I'm going to fast forward this video just a little.
You know,
this
it's the extinguisher here.
This area that we're about to see is where the Thai and Burmese workers were living when this happened. Many of them were still sleeping in their beds when grenades and RPGs were being shot into their house. They actually didn't know what was going on at the time.
Burnt it, and everything collapsed down. So it's yes.
You can actually see inside here, if I just fast forward a little bit, you can see those are the actual bunk beds that they were living in. It's been completely burned and of course gone. But I'm going to move us a little forward, and in the interest of time, I'm going to point out something that I actually found to be extremely powerful here. It's this area right here. This is the garden that the Thai and Burmese workers plant from produce from their home countries that they bring, and they plant this produce to remind them of home. They take care of these gardens, they weed the gardens, they work the gardens. And when I was there a month and a half later, the produce was ripe and was ready to be picked. The garden was overgrown a little bit, and there's nobody left there to pick it because so many had been killed or kidnapped. In total, there's about 41 workers that were there, and 19 of them were killed, 8 of them were kidnapped. I believe there were 30 Hamas terrorists that came into the kibbutz at that time. The next place I want to tell you about is Kibbutz Alumim. Actually, I want to show you something that's, I think, very unique along the way. I'm going to pull up that map one more time for just a moment. If we look on the road from Alumim, there's one road pretty much that goes all the way down here to Be'eri and goes past it and gets to Re'im over here. And all along this road, there were from Gaza, the terrorists came in mostly in trucks, little pickup trucks and small white vans. There's a lot of talk about the white trucks and the white cars that came in from Gaza. But there was also a lot of people that parachuted in. And people often don't understand what those parachutes might look like. I didn't. And they were littered all throughout this road, hundreds of them. Because again, 1,500 terrorists came in from Gaza, and at least 100 came and parachuted in, they believe. I've heard different numbers on that, so I don't want to be official when I say that, but a lot of parachutes came over the border and in on these sort of propellered parachutes. At one point, we were going around with 2 first responders who were there on the scene for long periods of time. They've gone through incredible trauma. And they pointed out some of these parachutes to us that were on the side of the road still a month and a half later, just laying there.
It's a parachute. It's a terrorist parachute that they got in here. It's a fun. There are 100 of them here. Of a human drone. That's how they got into the party. These things you're probably not going to be able to see in a few weeks, but yeah.
I just think it's a unique thing to point out because it's something that we don't always realize what they would look like. The next place that we should speak about for a moment is Kfar Aza. Now, Kfar Aza, as I showed on the map, I'm not going to pull it back up this moment, but Kfar Aza holds a particularly difficult place, I think, for a lot of Israelis. This is something I've noticed, at least being out here, that at first I didn't quite understand, and the more I spoke to people, the more I started to understand. It wasn't just that it was a very heavily hit kibbutz. Kfar Aza, when the terrorists came in, they immediately found themselves in what we'd call like the starter homes area, the place where the new families that were just starting out were renting or buying little houses up in. And I think that for many Israelis, we all can relate to the idea of our first home, our starter home, with all that hope. And these were the houses that terrorists rampaged through first and committed the atrocities and kidnapped and everything else you would imagine. So it makes it a particularly difficult thing to look at. And you're seeing here a lot of houses that are burned, really burned out completely. And that's because the way it usually would work oftentimes is that if they couldn't get to you in a house, they would burn the house down. They did this usually by cutting the gas lines. And they did this all across all the different kibbutzim. They would cut the gas lines and then set it on fire. And that would burn up the house, hoping that if you were in your safe room, it would smoke you out almost. You would run out the windows and they'd maybe shoot you out the windows or whatever it might be, or kidnap you. Some people, well, you can imagine what that meant for many of these homes. Something you might notice is the writing on these walls. When Zaka would come and clean up bodies or things like this, they would usually write on these walls different messages to each other to say, hey, we already cleaned this house, or we didn't, or someone was found here, or we got rid of the terrorists in this house. That was something in Be'eri we see a lot that we'll talk about later. That's one of the first responders who was with us that day. And we're going to keep moving on. But I want to just mention that in Kfar Aza, roughly 60 people were killed and 17 were kidnapped. That's at least the numbers right now. And again, the truth is that every day these numbers sometimes change a little bit because there's just new information coming out, even now, 2 months later. So when we're looking at these kibbutzim and we see the proximity to everything, we're getting the idea of how close they all were and how close they were to each other. The next kibbutz that I want to talk about for a moment is Nir Oz over here. And I realize also in the community there are some people related to Nir Oz. Nir Oz is the smallest of the kibbutzim. There's multiple kibbutzim that are small, but it was very, very hard hit and very small. The simple number is 1/4 of the population. 1 in every 4 people were either killed or kidnapped. Nir Oz is a particularly difficult story, but it was a beautiful kibbutz. And there's a lot of people love to speak about what this kibbutz is like in terms of its community, in terms of its landscape. And we captured some of this on a film we made about 2 weeks ago. I want to play just the opening of it, because I think the opening of that film really, really gives you a feeling of what these kibbutzim were like before October 7th. Founded in 1955, Kibbutz Nir Oz was created as a classic Israeli collective.
We celebrate holidays together.
It's one big family. Everybody know each other, everybody know the kids, everybody know the adults, everybody know everyone.
The kibbutz still holds to its founding communal values. Its 400 members are clustered in an area of about 140 acres.
Always you see kids on a bicycle and someone that play in the playground.
You see all the green, you see the people. It's paradise.
And we can see how close Gaza is here. If you look here, right through this gate, you can see Gaza, you can see the Gaza Strip. You can see buildings even. It was so easy for them to come in.
So they would come, just cut the fence, got on their motorbikes, cars, whatever, and came in, just driving.
It's a small place. It takes about 10 minutes to walk from one end to the other end of the kibbutz. So it was very easy for the terrorists to go around the kibbutz and through all the houses. The aftermath is tough to see because they were there for so long without the army. And I'll explain that in a minute because this is a somewhat unique to this kibbutz and what happened to them. Again, we're seeing a similar effect here of houses where the gas lines were cut and then set on fire, or where they would throw grenades in. You get the idea. But I do want to set one thing straight that I've heard a lot that is really, really misinformation as far as we know. I'm going to let this play for just a moment. Sorry, even for me it chokes me up a little. It's a little hard to see it because I've spent a lot of time over there. We found in Nir Oz, by the way, in some of these houses there was nothing left except for what doesn't get burned, and one of those was particularly a Chanukiah. There's been a few Chanukiahs that have been found in the kibbutzim because they're metal and they don't burn so easily, and they become really important artifacts and memorabilia that we've brought back to families. This is inside one of, in case you're curious what this was, this over here is the inside of a safe room, a bomb shelter, that was blown open, and the people inside, I believe, were kidnapped, and some of them were killed, but to give you an idea. Something that's very important to point out about Nir Oz, that really gives you a feeling of something, is that Nir Oz, it really is a duality, in the sense that you can see a whole block that is completely burned and destroyed, and it looks terrible. And then you look one street over and there's these pristine houses that are almost frozen in time. It looks like the holiday of Sukkot is going on still. You see a sukkah still and kids' bicycles strewn about like they were there yesterday. But the hardest part about Nir Oz is that the houses that were burned are hard to see, but it's what you find in the houses that look like they're okay that is really difficult to see. Because those are the houses where they could find the people. When they couldn't find them, they burned down the house. When they could find them, that's where they committed atrocities often. It happened in both, but that's one place. I cut the video before we go into that window because inside is very difficult imagery, and I don't think we need to see more of that. That's Nir Oz in a nutshell. There's one thing I want to point out though. There's two things. So Nir Oz is one of the most, for me at least I could find, and many other people found, ways to really understand what happened there is actually through their group chat. They had a kibbutz group chat where they were all speaking all the time, live updating what was going on. And it's a very, very difficult read. We used it in a film to really illustrate the story of Nir Oz. I think it was a good way, rather than having spoken word, to showcase what happened there through written text of their words. And I should mention, one of the most difficult aspects of Nir Oz is that the army never came. And what I mean by that is that when the army finally did come, it was 2 hours or more after the terrorists on their own left. In other words, the terrorists were there as long as they wanted. They could do anything. They went house to house systematically. And then they left. And then the army came 2 hours later. So there's a saying around Nir Oz that if you survived Nir Oz, it was a miracle. People have a very difficult time talking about Nir Oz because of this, and now it's looking roughly like it'll be about 3 years of rebuilding before anyone's really able to go back there and live back in that community. That's at least current estimates. And again, Nir Oz, a quarter of the population was killed or kidnapped. I have to admit, it's very strange, again, speaking to you all, because I know you're all listening to me, but I can't see any of you. I have no feedback, so I hope this is at least being informative. I want to mention one thing here, actually, though, that I think is actually important to mention, something that gets lost, and there's a story, it's not even a story, it's a theme, that I know will come out. I know it will come out, but it's going to take a few months. And the reason this is going to take a few months is that the atrocities that happened are so big and so heavy, it drowns out anything else. But there are some important lessons and important themes that need to come out because they give us hope. And I want to just speak about two of those for a moment. One is a simple fact, and when it takes a lot of interviewing to see this come out, but after interviewing hundreds of people, we started to see a quiet theme that even the interview subjects didn't always see. It started bubbling out, which was how the kibbutz life and kibbutz movements saved thousands of people. And let me explain that just a little more. Essentially, when October 7th happened, it was a media blackout. For the first while, there was no accurate information of what was going on. It caught everyone off guard. The media was trying to play catch up. So there was no news. Simultaneously, there was no government. There was no army. They didn't show up for a while. Oftentimes, it took us 6 hours to get the army there, and that was in some of the better situations. During this time, the people in these kibbutzim, in these little communities, they reached out to each other. And through these group chats and through phone calls, they immediately created a real-time live news update ticker, essentially, of chatting with each other that was giving real live updates on where the terrorists were, what they were doing at all times. It was like 1,000 eyes on them. In other words, these terrorists were not running around blind in these kibbutzim. There was a constant piece of communication. And this is so important to speak about because what it speaks to specifically is that they were helping each other. And while there were communities that were decimated, like Nir Oz, and many others that we've heard about, and horrible stories, many people survived in hiding, many people escaped because their neighbors were helping them and knew what was going on. And we hear that story over and over and over. I texted so-and-so, I texted this person, I heard from this person. It's how the information went around. And it really is a sign that essentially the power of community, one of the most powerful aspects of it, is not just that it makes you feel good to be near people. We all love having friends, or most of us do. But that it actually can save lives in situations like this. And you see this in extreme situations around the world, but you saw it here, and eventually that story will start to come out because there's incredible heroism in this. There's also a very unique story that I think is worth mentioning from Sderot. This was an interview I heard from someone else, actually, not straight from the person, about their neighbor. Essentially their neighbor, this man, I'm not going to use names right now, but this man who ran into his bomb shelter with his safe room, different names for it, bomb shelter, safe room, mamad, it's all the same thing. He ran in there with his father and with his family, his kids and his wife, and they hid in there, but the terrorists saw him go in there, Hamas saw, and they ran to the room and shot through the door, but they couldn't get in. They were holding the door shut, him and his father. But they shot through it anyway, and then the terrorists got distracted or something happened, they left. And he was alone there with his family, and his father had been shot multiple times, but he was alive. And he had to make a choice. What do I do? Do I leave and try to run through the fields, which he knew these fields well, he knew how to get out, but they could see him, and if they saw him with the family, they would be killed. Or does he stay in the safe room, but his father is dying? What do you do? He reached out to his community for answers. Multiple people talked to him. Eventually he chose to stay. They told him, don't leave. If you leave, they're going to see you. They're all around. And so he stayed. His father did die. But he doesn't carry this alone. And that's the important part, is that in any scenario like that, no matter if it was the right decision or wrong decision, whatever, you can only imagine what he's feeling about things. But he doesn't carry it alone because his whole community helped him make that choice. They are all together in this. And I think that is a powerful, powerful message. That there were examples of people being alone during this October 7th massacres. But there's a lot more examples of communities coming together, which as Jewish people we have done for thousands of years. And I just think that especially on a day like Hanukkah, it is so important to remember these lessons. Because we've spent many months zeroing in on the horrors that happened, and we should continue to. But these lessons should also provide us with hope and encouragement, because they are beautiful amongst these terrible tragedies. Anyway, I'm going to move on to Be'eri. Now, Kibbutz Be'eri, let me actually pull up that map one more time, because hopefully it's giving us an idea of where things are here. Kibbutz Be'eri is right up the road. And I want to just point out again how close these kibbutzim are to each other. These roads, this road right here that connects, for example, from Re'im to Be'eri, when we went with first responders back to these areas that they had been driving up and down, trying to help people from these kibbutzim all throughout the 7th and the 8th and the 9th, they described that these roads were littered with broken down cars, burnt cars, bodies, all kinds of things. This atrocity did not just affect the communities, it affected the entire region because these terrorists ran from place to place to place. Be'eri is one of the largest of the kibbutzim around. It takes a solid, I would almost say 45 minutes to walk across it from one end to the other, especially on the long side. And I've done it a few times. And it also is a very diverse population where you've got older houses down here in the 400s, and you've got these brand new houses in an area called the Vineyard. And both were hit very badly, but differently. There's also countless examples of heroism within Be'eri, because this is the place where there was fierce army battles with Hamas, with the terrorists, back and forth and back and forth. And it happened all throughout the kibbutz. There's famous examples of a clinic in the middle of it. There's famous examples of how people saved each other's lives. They called it the war of the safe rooms over in the Vineyard over here, because they felt like they were fighting within safe rooms. And then there's this area in the 400s block, which most of the houses were reduced to rubble, real complete rubble. And we're going to speak about those for a moment here. Let me just find that one piece. Here we are. All right. Before I do this, I want to point out something that we did that was very unique, though. So one of the problems with trying to capture Kibbutz Be'eri in all of the stories is that almost every news article confuses people. And I've seen articles that have tried to break down exactly what happened in Be'eri, what's the story behind Be'eri. However, what we found is that as you try to break down this story, it's so complex because so much happened in Be'eri all over the place that it's very easy to confuse everyone on the landscape of it, or where it was, or how it looks, or anything of the sort, because it's just so many different angles to pick from, unfortunately. So we tried to do something very unique, which took a lot of permissions to get. We contacted the IDF, the Israeli army. We contacted the kibbutz themselves to see if we could get permission to do this. Essentially, the idea was, in order to take in the vast landscape and all the different sort of angles of what happened here, or at least to try to, and to try to give people a sense of its scope, we wanted to fly a drone during a time of war, which already right now drones are banned in Israel. Like, you have to have very special permission to fly a drone. But we have a way of flying a very specific, unique kind of drone that can fly not just above the kibbutzim, but through it, and actually through windows and through houses. We've used this sometimes for doing real estate videos in the past. But here the idea was, could we fly it through to give a full spectrum, broad feel of the community and of the devastation? And we felt that it was important. We finally got permission to do it, and we did. We flew around the kibbutz, and that's the video I want to show you now. Nobody has actually seen this video yet. We filmed this a few days ago, and we're going to be turning it into a piece. So you're the first to see this. The few people that have seen it since have found it to be very powerful, without any narration, without any text, and I don't think you need any. You just need to know that this is a community that faced real atrocities. And I'm going to let this piece speak for itself. We're in the area called the Vineyards right now, by the way. These are the newer houses. you're seeing now is an overview of the vineyards area. You can see just how many houses have been affected, destroyed, and burnt down here in this area. This area right next to it that we're flying through here is called the 500s. It's the numbers of the houses, also destroyed. And you'll see as we fly over the kibbutz towards the other end of the kibbutz, the random houses between things. When we got to the other end already, there was actually a fog that was setting in nearby. And you'll see a completely different look now to the kind of destruction, where full houses, the sides of the houses, were cleared out essentially from fierce battles with the Israeli army and Hamas terrorists. Over here, you're going to see one of the safe room windows that was shot many times with bullets. You can see the markings there. But now here's a house that I wanted to talk to you about. And this is actually the subject of our documentary, so it's a good segue to speak about it. This house right in front of you, this window. I'm going to pause it there for a moment. So I hope you could see, by the way, the difference between some of those areas in Be'eri and the vast landscape that was affected by October 7th. It's really large, and it's complex. The last house we were going towards right there, we decided that we wanted to make a documentary specifically on one story that might stick out to us in one way that was a little different than some of the others. And we actually stumbled on this one during a few of the interviews. We met this woman who was talking to us. The house you just saw at the end that we were kind of coming towards a window of, or what's left of the house, is the house of someone named Perah Pilo. And Perah is a 75-year-old woman who pretty much grew up in the kibbutz from the time she was, I think, 7 years old. She's lived there her whole life. She's actually the daughter of Holocaust survivors. Her mother died when she was very young. And her father, when I say very young, I mean I think she was like 6 or 5 years old. And her father helped to raise her, but very quickly when they moved to Israel from Hungary, they found kibbutzim was a good place to start, to build the beginnings of a life. And so she was given to this kibbutz with her brother and I think her sister. And essentially they were raised by the kibbutz. The father would visit every few weekends, essentially, but the kibbutz was truly their home. And Be'eri, she was there early on. She's been living there so long that the street that her house is on is called Perah Pilo Drive, or Perah Pilo Street, something like this. It's named after her because she's been there so long. She was there when her house was built, when this house was built, along with a few others. And she really made it her own. She built these amazing gardens nearby because she loved flowers. Her name, Perah, means flowers in Hebrew. It wasn't her original name. This was the name that was given to her when they immigrated to Israel because they couldn't pronounce her original name from Hungary. So she said, I want to go with flowers because she loved flowers. And she was a staple of the kibbutz. She's a person who whenever she knew all of her neighbors. When we were interviewing her the first time, she talked all about how the little kids next door across the street used to always come up to her and ask her, Perah, you have this amazing garden. How do you do it? Which flowers? And she would explain the different flowers to the little kids that were living across the street. Or they would ask her, Perah, you're living alone. And she said, yes. And they said, is that lonely? And she said, no, being alone is sometimes nice. Because her kids had grown up and moved on, and her husband was no longer in the picture many years later. And she would take walks with her other neighbors. She was very much that, quote, little old lady that everybody knew in the neighborhood. And that's Perah. Now, Perah's story of October 7th is, to me, fascinating for many reasons. But I should warn you ahead of time that it's not a story of fighting Hamas to the end, with many battles of gunfire or something like that. It's not that kind of hero story. And it's also not the kind of story of there I was and everybody was being killed around me, so to speak. It's a story of resilience. I'm going to tell you the ending right now. She lives. It's a story of a woman who, against all odds, survived one of the worst atrocities a person could, and did it with such bravery. It's remarkable. But her story doesn't start on October 7th. It actually starts 10 years prior. You see, 10 years prior to this, to October 7th, she had a dream. It was a dream that she dreamed, this vivid dream that she couldn't shake, of Hamas terrorists, or terrorists in general, who built tunnels under Gaza all the way to her house. And they popped up right outside of her house and were standing out of her windows. They didn't come in, they stood and they watched. And it terrified her. When she woke up, she was so terrified that she called a locksmith, and she convinced this locksmith to come and build a deadbolt lock onto her safe room door. Now, these are bomb shelters. They are built for rocket attacks or for plane attacks. The idea is to actually not lock the door in case you have to run out for some reason. But she wanted a lock built because of this terrible nightmare she had of terrorists trying to get into her house. And 10 years later, this lock saved her life, or partly saved her life. October 7th, for her, started the way that many, I'm going to tell you this story because this is one that we want to start making things about because we find it to be so important. So for her, October 7th started the way that so many of these stories start. They heard the sirens. 6:30 a.m., the sirens are blaring, Tseva Adom, red alert, red alert, red alert. And so, as usual, she runs into her safe room, but something felt different to her. She couldn't explain why. For some reason, she grabbed her blanket. Normally you go in and you come right out 5-10 minutes later. In their case, they have such little time to get in there anyway. They're only in there for a short time before the rockets have fallen. But for some reason, she decided to grab her blanket. She was in her pajamas. She grabs her blanket. She's barefoot. She runs in, and she grabbed a little bottle of water that was only half full. She gets in there. She closes the door. The rockets, as she describes it, just kept on coming. It was not the usual one rocket, two rockets, a few rockets, that's it. These were just non-stop for a while. And eventually, they started to quiet down. But suddenly, her phone was ringing off the hook. Now, in her safe room, I just want to describe this. It's a small little room. It's the size of a closet, pretty much. It's very tiny. And she has a little TV in it, and she's got a little shelf. I think she's used it for some storage stuff from time to time, as many Israelis do. And it has one light bulb at the top, and it's got a window with these big metal grates that close to make it essentially bulletproof, bomb-proof. The walls are made of reinforced concrete. There's no getting into this place. Well, if you have a lock on your door, at least, in her case. And suddenly her phone started buzzing that there were terrorists around. And this was unusual. This was different. What do you mean terrorists around? This is not something they were used to. And so she immediately locks her door, and she sits down and waits. And her phone continues to buzz, and she turns on her TV, and the news is just starting to kick in. Something about terrorism and terrorists coming from Gaza into different communities. She's hearing about this, and it's buzzing on her phone. They're getting in, and then suddenly, oh my God, they've gotten into the kibbutz. And she's hearing about them getting into the kibbutz, across the kibbutz. And slowly through her phone, she's getting more and more updates as they get closer and closer. Now they're getting close to her neighbors. She's hearing names. She knows everybody. She's hearing the names of people that are, 20 houses away, now 10 houses away, now 5 houses away. Now they're at her neighbors, and then all at once, the power got cut. Everything went dark. The only light left in her room was from her cell phone and a little sliver of light from the door, from the window that was peeking in just a little bit. It was quiet for a few moments, and then she started hearing the gunshots and the bombs and the things outside. Immediately, they were banging on her door. They were there, and she was terrified, as any of us would be. Suddenly she hears them shooting at the door, but they can't get in. The lock is holding. Then she hears them drilling at the door, and they're drilling at the bottom and at the top and all over, and they're screaming and they're banging, and they can't get in, and they can't get in, and she's gripping her blanket, which had a beautiful mosaic of flowers on it. I've seen it, it's a beautiful blanket. She gripped her blanket and hit up against a wall, desperately hoping that her lock would hold. And it did. It continued to hold. The day went on. She could hear them right outside her door. Fierce fighting, non-stop shooting and guns and machine guns that fire, everything you can imagine, bombs going off. The way she describes it is in such vivid detail and also so scattered because the sounds were coming from everywhere, reverberating off the walls. The day was ticking on. She had been in touch with her son. She was able to get a hold of her son, saying, "Please help me, the terrorists are here." And he was desperately trying to get to her. She didn't know it at the time, but he was getting stuck along the way because nobody could get to the Kfar Aza area, to the Gaza envelope. The army had locked off anything. He couldn't get to her. Her daughter is religious. She's Chabad, so she wasn't getting the messages. And it was getting closer and closer. She was watching as her phone battery was dying bit by bit. Right before it died, she finally called her daughter and left a message. She had to leave a message saying goodbye to her daughter because she was not sure she was going to make it. When she describes this message, it's difficult to hear. How do you tell your daughter this? How do you say goodbye? Her daughter, remember, has no idea any of this is going on. No idea. She didn't know it, but at the time, someone was running on their way, running through the areas where her daughter was to find her at shul and in her synagogue and tell her what was going on. And then her phone died. And she was all alone. There was no more light, and nighttime had set in. It was Saturday night now. The terrorists were still outside every so often trying to get in, but had almost given up on getting into her place, at least for the time being. But they continued to shoot. They continued to have their firefight. This continued for hours, and she lost track of time, as any of us would. She also had little water. She had found in the mamad somewhere a little package of cookies. And the way she says it, she ate, and she tells me this very sternly, I ate 2 cookies a day, or 2 cookies every bunch of hours, something like this. She made this little package last. And she had this much water, which was long gone. So dehydration was kicking in. She started feeling weak. But she stayed, and time continued to pass. The next day, she watched as the little bit of sliver of light crept back in, and somewhere during that day, and she's not exactly sure when, suddenly she heard the sounds of something like a bulldozer. And she knew that there was work being done on the houses right next to her as recent as a few weeks ago. So she knew the terrorists had found those bulldozers, had hijacked them, and were attempting to bulldoze down her house. Before she knew it, the entire house was shaking violently. And the bomb shelter as well was shaking violently with dust and soot and stuff falling from the ceilings. It made this terrible, she describes as a terrible smell, and coughing, and she already has terrible breathing issues. So suddenly she couldn't breathe. She took what little water she had left, put it on a rag, and started breathing through the rag. And she waited. She tried to get towards the window, and as she lifted up, she fell, and she passed out. She had dreams. And she describes these dreams as something on the lines of a figure that she can't make out baking bread with her, Hungarian bread of some type. When she kind of came to, she describes this as almost a state of waking and sleep simultaneously, something kind of in between. When she started to come to, She pulled herself to her bed and saw that the door was just a little bit ajar, a little bit open. The mamad door, the bomb shelter door. A little sliver of life was poking in, and she was terrified. She cried up against the wall. She clawed up against the wall in order not to be seen. But she noticed it was silent now. It was quiet. And she decided that this was her time to make her escape. So she, for the first time, opened her bomb shelter windows, the iron gates that opened, and for the first time looked outside and could see her whole neighborhood. She pulled herself out of this with her blanket, out of the window, onto the rubble down below, and used the blanket. She put it in front of her. She was barefoot, so she used the blanket. She would walk 5 steps, and then she'd throw the blanket further and walk on it 5 more steps. And she looked around at her neighborhood. She found that across the street, where the little kids came over and asked her all these questions about her garden, that family had all been killed, including the kids. Across the other street, one of her best friends who she used to walk around the kibbutz with, her house was used to take 15 other hostages into the house, and they were all killed in that house. Across the street on the other way was another house of a couple that was also murdered. She didn't know this just yet. In this moment, she just knew to get across the kibbutz. She made her way slowly to a main road, and when she finally got to the main road, she started walking, and she found in front of her a golf cart with the keys still in it. So she got in, she turned it on, and she started driving to the kibbutz exit. And when she got towards the exit, you can imagine these soldiers that were there waiting, looking over, and all these soldiers had seen for the last hour or two was bodies being taken out. No one alive. And suddenly, there's a 75-year-old woman frantically driving side to side on a golf cart, dehydrated and everything, in her pajamas, barefoot, towards them. They were shocked. They ran to her and started touching her just to pinch that she was real. Perah Pilo was the last person to come out alive of Be'eri, to be found alive. Her story, she had survived 36 hours in a tiny closet with a full war, with the terrorists using her house as a base of operations of some type for the neighborhood. It turned out it wasn't them that bulldozed the house. The Israeli army, to get to the terrorists, bulldozed the entire house around her while she was in it. This was a story of resilience. This is a story that is one of the most fundamental Jewish stories through our history. Over and over, we have survived. And this was a story of survival. And that is why we wanted to turn this into a documentary to showcase this story of this family. Her family, by the way, her extended family, her sister, her daughter, had been told that she was dead already. They were all told she was dead. And for all of them, this was a miracle to find out she was alive. But her daughter never gave up. Her daughter kept saying, you don't know my mother, she's alive. I would know if she's not. That's her story. I would show you a picture of her, but I actually think it's more powerful for you to imagine and not know exactly what she looks like, because she is all of us. She is any of us. She is all of our people. I will show you for just a moment. I'm going to show you her house. We went back there with a volunteer. This is a volunteer named Ophir, to find belongings of hers and bring it back to her, where she's now staying in the Dead Sea, along with much more of the Be'eri and the King David Hotel. A lot of the communities over there right now. This is inside. This is her bomb shelter. She's painted. She's an artist. And that's her, of course, the lock on her door. And this is what her house looked like after they bulldozed through it. There's on the ceiling, you see all the gunshots and explosives that went off. And this is the door that was ajar. And this is her view outside of her window. That's the neighbor's house across the street. So, I know we're running low on time, so I want to skip ahead fast here and jump over to a Q&A. I've started a bunch of questions that have come our way, so I'm just going to take a few of them one by one. We're going to take here, I don't know who asked this question, but I have here, what is all the graffiti on the houses at Kfar Aza? So the graffiti on the houses is specifically graffiti. Some of it was written by Hamas, but most of the time Hamas did not write much where they were rampaging around. They were really focused on one thing, which was kidnap, kill, and other atrocities that we've heard a lot about more recently. The graffiti is most of the time either Zaka, which is essentially the cleanup crew, to say that there were bodies found in this house, or it's markings from the army saying we cleared this house. Most of the time that's what it was in Kfar Aza and many of the other places. I believe that's what you're asking about with the graffiti. But there is some graffiti, unless you're asking about the graffiti, there is some graffiti that Hamas did leave behind in some places, but most of the time it's these other ones. The next question I've got here is, can I talk about how some of the kibbutz security teams were able to defend their kibbutz? Yes, there's many stories. There's one story, and I'm going to mix up which kibbutz exactly this was, and I apologize when I mixed up. There's one very powerful story of how one kibbutz was running the security forces in the kibbutz. They're sort of like it's like their neighborhood watch, but with guns. And they were fighting off the terrorists, but they started running out of ammunition. And so they quickly called another kibbutz that had not yet been attacked by Hamas. And that kibbutz had to make a choice. Do we send our people over to this other one to protect that, but leave our kibbutz exposed? Or do we stay and wait in case they come here? And they chose to go to the other kibbutz anyway, which they did, because again, this real-time news network that they had created, they kind of knew they weren't there yet. And they together fought off the terrorists at that kibbutz and pushed them away because they were willing to help each other out. But in Be'eri, there's a lot of stories about incredible bravery that the kibbutz security teams showcased, but also a lot of tragedy in that. There was one place, which we might make a whole video on, of the clinic, it's called. And if you want, you can look this up later. Look up the story about the clinic at Be'eri, and you'll see a heartbreaking story, but incredible bravery at the same time. So I hope that answers that question. I see one more question here, which is, how are you able to cope with all that you have been seeing and witnessing these last months? There is a disconnect that I have from most of the people that live here. I think it's speaking to something that's uncomfortable to speak to because we don't like to admit it. I'm very much, I'm Jewish, I really do love Israel, and I feel very connected. I've spent a lot of my life in this place, but I'm not Israeli. And there is just something fundamentally different in a way that is hard to explain. That when I go to these kibbutzim and I see these things, I sympathize with it. I look at it and I say, this is horrible. But it is different than when some of the people that I know have been there and they see it, and this is where they have been. I have friends that go down to Be'eri and say, I've spent so much of my life walking in these fields during Dar Ramadan when the flowers, these red flowers come up every year and it's a big celebration. There is a difference in this. If this happened in Boston, in Massachusetts, if this happened to the local the towns around there, I don't think I'd be able to hold up. But there is something about it here that allows me to keep just enough distance to be able to kind of almost safely tell these stories, at least in this area. But it's not easy. And there are still things that get to you when you see, for example, a child's bedroom and then you see the atrocities that took place in that bedroom. It doesn't matter who you are, it hits you. There are things that are difficult to see, but they are important to see, and they are part of our history, and they are part of what make us who we are, and I think that's important. I truly believe that the work I'm doing now of making these films and telling these stories and getting this messaging out there is probably some of the most important work I'm going to do in my life. And I just hope that I can give the right respect that these stories deserve as I make them and put them out there. I think that's the best answer I can give for it, as much as I can. But it's not easy. So, I know this is a difficult topic. I hope that this was informative. I hope that this was helpful and that it at least maybe cleared up some questions people have or talked about some interesting things. I would tell you more about the documentary that we're working on, but it's a lot of sort of thematic ideas of how we're dealing with things within it that I just don't have to go into right now. But I do want to say thank you to the community because in no small part, because of all of you and because of your community, it looks like we're going to be able to make this. We got seed funding through the community. I actually want to send a special thanks out to the Harold Grinspoon Foundation, who has put some money in to get us started with this, which is really, really fantastic. Because I think we'll be able to tell a very, very powerful and much needed story that while I fully believe that the volunteer efforts that are going on and the mass amount of money that is needed to all of these communities are extremely important right now, I do think that there's also things like these stories that need to come out and that a year from now we're going to look back at and need to hear these things. So I believe there's a power to all of this. And yeah. So thank you again for all of your time. I unfortunately can't hear any of you, so I have no idea what you're all saying right now, so I'm just going to close it out and say thank you. And stay safe, stay well. Chag Sameach, happy Hanukkah, even if it's the end. And I hope to see you all soon.